Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this IDFOC webinar this evening on peacekeeping in the cyber age. And this evening we have four panelists with us, who each of whom have a particular expertise that they will share with us tonight. Very briefly, they are Deirdre Carberry, Paul Farrell, Mark Williams, and Matt O'Neill. And what I'll do is, as we go through, I'll just introduce those each panelist in a bit more detail. Just to mention that there is a Q&A functionality, so if there are questions you'd like to ask, there will be an opportunity at the end for a discussion, and we welcome all your questions and all your questions. We'll certainly try to answer them. And also that we are recording the event tonight, and I have remembered to press record. So we would hopefully have a copy of this to share with everybody in a few days. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Deirdre. So Deirdre is a security strategist, gender advisor, and a military veteran. She joined the Defence Forces in 2004, serving as an infantry officer and gender advisor for 15 years, including 2 overseas deployments with the UN in Lebanon and the Democratic Republic of Congo, more recently. She is a director and a gender advisor to the ONE, that's the Óglaigh Náisiúnta na hÉireann, which is the Ireland's National Veterans Organisation. Deirdre recently retired from the military and now works in the tech industry as a security strategist. So she's bringing both sides, perspective from both sides this evening. She has a comprehensive background in gender diversity and inclusion, working with the UN and NATO to progress the women, peace and security agenda. She is an international instructor on the Human Security Advisors course in the UK Defence Academy in Trivenham and lectures internationally on peace and security issues. She's committed to gender mainstreaming and is an outspoken advocate for gender equality. She's also the chair of the World Health Innovation Summit Expert Panel for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment. WHIS is responsible for progressing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So Deirdre, I'm going to hand this over to you now, and let me know, you're going to talk about the human security and set the scene. So let me know if you want to change the slide or anything. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Good evening, everyone. I generally like to start any discussions with my bottom line up front, and that is essentially that the UN and troop and police contributing countries need to adapt to a new reality. And we as a country need to not only adapt, resource and train for this new reality and the future of peacekeeping, but use our influence and skills to assist those nations we're going to be serving alongside and who we are relying on to collect information, analyze that information and execute operations on the ground. I feel that a UN force is only as effective as its weakest troop contributing country, so TCC. The blue helmet and the United Nations flag, as we know, no longer offer natural protection. The operational environments now feature armed groups, terrorists, organized crime, street gangs, criminal and political exploitation, disease and viruses, sexual gender-based violence, and really effective information operations and psychological operations by extremist groups, and of course, a host of other threats. So the era of Chapter 6 style peacekeeping is over, but the United Nations and TCC's countries, TCCs are by and large, I think, still gripped by Chapter 6 syndrome. So if we don't change our mindset, if the UN and our military forces do not change our mindsets, take risks, and show a willingness to understand and analyze and face these new challenges, I think we will be consciously sending troops into harm's way. And I saw this firsthand in the DRC, where we lost 7 peacekeepers during one single, very poorly planned and executed offensive operation against an illegal armed group in the eastern part of the DRC. So what does that reality look like on the ground, this contemporary operational environment that we speak of, and why does a human security approach make sense? Certainly to me, not just when we deploy on peace operations with the UN or NATO, but also domestically too. I'm going to briefly introduce the topic of human security and gender for those who are unfamiliar with the concepts, and then offer a very broad overview of the thematic areas our peacekeeping force forces are facing on the ground, highlighting key drivers of conflict and enablers like increased activity, lack of usable data and information, lack of informed analysis, because as we know, up until very recently, intelligence was considered a dirty word for the UN. A lack of information sharing and a lack of capabilities and basic skills of many TCCs, particularly cyber domain. And I saw this very clearly, as I said, in MONUSCO, the UN mission in the DRC. So we need to, I think, from the outset, ask ourselves a few very important questions throughout these presentations and kind of keep them to the forefront of our minds. The first is, how do we reduce not only the threat, but the vulnerabilities of those that we are mandated to protect? And how also do we reduce the vulnerabilities in our own military force? The second thing I'd ask you to think about is that we talk a lot about operational effectivity, but what does this actually look like? What does success look like in the context of peace operations? And how do we measure the success? Because we can't manage or improve what we can't measure. And I think data is the key in this endeavor. When we talk about human security, it's an approach to national and international security that gives primacy to human beings and our complex social and economic interactions. The scope of global security, and it's just highlighted there on the slide, generally we term it as 7 areas of threat to the individual: economic, food, health, environmental, political, community, and personal. Human security includes what is much, much broader than protection from physical violence. And what's really important is all these elements are interdependent. Now, it would be remiss of me as a gender advisor not to get gender in there. And as a gender advisor, I've long advocated for a gendered approach to conflict analysis, strategic and operational planning. And why? Well, basically, gender is an essential element of any analysis and approach to peace operations, as it cross-cuts every aspect of our societies. How I'm perceived right now, for example, understanding gender constructs is key to gaining situational awareness across a spectrum of social, cultural, political, and economic issues, and also then taking appropriate measures to address them. I will outline how this looks in reality, but when we look at, say, if we just take the Global Gender Equality Index and view those countries at the very bottom of that league table, we have the DRC, we have Mali, Chad, Yemen, Central African Republic, Afghanistan. We can draw a clear connection between inequality and insecurity. And on just gender equality, we see that the larger the gender gap is in a country, the more likely that country is to be involved in intra and interstate conflict, to be the first to resort to force in such conflicts, and to resort to higher levels of violence. So for me, for population-centric operations to respond to the security needs of the whole community, our understanding has to be gendered. We must understand the roles that males and females play, women and men of different ages, their access to power and resources, because this will assist us in understanding the specific security threats affecting women, men, girls, and boys. This is about being smarter and more targeted in our approach. In Mali, for example, and Mali offers a great example of a really complex environment. The security threats faced by an 8-year-old girl in the Mopti region of central Mali are very different to those facing a 15-year-old male in Gao. Age and sex matters. Conflict and crisis don't discriminate, but people and social structures do. We need to understand these threats and how they are interdependent and interrelated, because this allows us to put in place more appropriate protection and response strategies as the peacekeeping force. If I can give kind of an example, that 8-year-old girl, already disadvantaged from being born female into a traditional patriarchal society, legally unable to hold land in her name, with limited, if any, access to education, no access to reproductive health care, likely to have many children at a very, very young age. Those two will be disadvantaged from birth. She is particularly vulnerable to sexual violence, female genital mutilation, early forced marriage, and/or human trafficking. And why does this matter? Well, almost all UN peacekeeping operations now include elements in their mandate of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which specifically gives us the military tasks of preventing preempting and responding to sexual gender-based violence. If we look at that 15-year-old male, he is particularly vulnerable to forced recruitment into armed groups and radicalization, which I'll talk to in a couple of moments. With Mali, again, we have the troops there deployed under the UN and the EU. We see long-standing ethnic, communal tensions, weak governance, protracted drought, limited employment opportunities, external interference by nations, high birth rate and school closures. These are all the interdependent human security factors driving the current conflict in Mali. If I just use the example of the mission I served in most recently, MONUSCO, we see a myriad of human security factors has hampered and is still hampering peace and stability efforts in the DRC. During my time, 2018, 2019, we had Ebola. We still have a measles outbreak, human rights abuses by the national armed forces and police, the UN military forces, strategic partners in the mission. We have ethnic violence, children recruited into armed groups, limited employment, limited access to education, sexual violence, economic and food insecurity. It's widespread inequality across the board. And if we just take sexual violence in the DRC, the effects echo across generations through trauma, stigma, poverty, poor health, and unwanted pregnancies. Sexual violence is an interesting one because it tears away at the very social fabric of communities and ensures that those communities are destabilized for generations to come. Sexual violence is a security issue, and because it's an incredibly effective tactic utilized by illegal armed groups. But very often our forces, our military forces, don't have the capabilities to go out and engage, to collect the information and to prevent and preempt and respond to it. I met loads of children in the DRC whose mothers had been raped, whose very existence emanates from the violence that are there, and they've been labeled bad blood or children of the enemy. So we also saw their sexual violence against men and boys. We saw that it was widespread and it was regularly used as an instrument of torture, humiliation, and terror. So the bodies of women and men and children are now part of the terrain in conflict. So we have to ask ourselves, how are we equipping our forces to deal with these issues, to not just respond to them, but prevent and preempt them? Inequality, climate change, gender, CIMIC, which is civil military cooperation, information operations, protection of civilians. It's about making sure these areas that were traditionally viewed and still viewed by many as soft issues are at the core of defense and security, because without understanding them, taking tangible actions and incorporating them into our planning processes at the strategic, operational, and tactical level, we will fail. These are the military mission, and viewing them as, add-ons is why the effectivity of UN peacekeeping operations is consistently being questioned, and rightly so. The UN has empowered many countries to do jobs that they're just not capable of doing. I'd like to just, for the purpose of our topics that we're here to discuss, just take a moment to focus on radicalization and extremism to highlight the points I've just made. We see that extremism is amongst the major challenges to peace faced in today's world. The numbers of fatalities resulting from terrorist attacks perpetrated by violent extremist groups has risen steeply over the past 2 decades. And we see, if we look to Africa, violent extremism keeps spreading, showing notable resilience despite years of counter-extremism and prevention efforts by governments and international actors. In addition to killing thousands, it cost the affected region an estimated 97 billion in lost informal economic activity each year. This is a major issue. It's a major security issue, both domestically and when we're deployed overseas. We have to look at the root causes, those long-term structural causes, and the proximate causes, some of those more recent changes that are exacerbating underlying tensions. And from I guess my experience, it's not enough to just counter violent extremism by addressing the symptoms. We have to understand and focus on the root causes in regions such as the Western Sahel, because this is essential to countering that violent extremism. We must take a whole of society collaborative approach. And I know as militaries, collaboration, particularly with those that are external to military structures, isn't something that comes very natural to us. Countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are suffering the consequences of climate change, a major issue that isn't talked about enough in military circles. Increasing drought and water shortages make it harder for people who depend on agriculture and livestock to make a living, access food, and to support their families. So joining a non-state armed group for income and food is sometimes the only option. So it's not very often about ideology. Poverty, youth unemployment, and the youth has to be a major focus of our analysis. Food insecurity and ultimately the erosion of livelihoods will, if unaddressed, lead to population displacement, rural-urban migration, and increased local demand, and thus competition for land and water, fueling those social tensions and, as we see in Mali, those intercommunal conflicts. Youth in particular are feeling marginalized and disenfranchised. They are being shaped and influenced online through social media and other forms. Terrorist and extremist organizations are experts in psychological and information operations, targeting women and men with carefully constructed messages. Just for the purpose of this topic as well, increased connectivity means that cyberspace will be a key front in any conflict going forward. And I think when we look at the last 18 months, COVID-19 has presented a perfect opportunity to extremist groups. Did we anticipate this? Were we as a country, were we as a military ready for this? That extended online presence of the youth during the pandemic, with limitations to access the outside world, without a doubt, has definitely increased the risk of radicalization. Almost all schools and tertiary education systems, especially universities, are now teaching online. So students now have no choice but to indulge in online learning, which grants them even more access to time on the internet. We also see common youth frustrations being exacerbated: unemployment, education inequalities, income inequalities, and lack of opportunities. Again, terror units are more inclined on gaining from these weaknesses during this time. We, in addition, see militant groups not only could provide a kind of a spiritual dictation to justify radicalization, but they may also have attained ways to provide economic and social benefits to youths who are suffering from this marginalization, disenfranchisement, confusion, maybe some personal grievances as well. And this allows radicalization and recruitment to be so much easier. And we do have to ask ourselves, how well are our militaries equipped to disrupt these processes? How well is the Irish Defence Forces equipped to disrupt these processes? Who are our strategic partners in countering radicalization domestically? And what capabilities do we have to deal with the manifestation on the ground when we're deployed on peace operations? Do all UN peacekeeping operations have, for example, an EW, an electronic warfare capability? And if not, then why? As the chief of the Information and Psychological Operations Cell in MONUSCO in the DRC, an EW capability would have been a game changer for me. And on its most simplified level, because the illegal armed groups were either using kind of Motorola's to communicate, or they were communicating over WhatsApp. So I do have to admit, states and social media companies have become more effective at countering jihadist propaganda. But if we just look at Europe, there are signs of convergence between the far left and far right around online conspiracy theories and the use of violence. And I think in an already polarized political society, social isolation, where we have now increased economic inequality as a result of the global pandemic, we're probably likely to deepen these attitudes and thus the prevailing threat. So how is Ireland prepared for these new movements like Boogaloo or QAnon? And domestically, do we have the necessary procedures, equipment, and imagination to preempt and deter all forms of attack? around kind of disinformation, infiltration. I probably just want to leave you with this before moving on to the next speakers. In the coming years, the way we work, fight, age, communicate, solve problems, live, exchange information, do business, connect, this will all be changed. And these are not developments we can stop, but we can shape them. They're already shaping the operational environment our peacekeeping forces find themselves operating in. And we can build our capabilities in anticipation of these inevitable changes. Indeed, if we choose not to, others will do it for us. So the UN and Ireland, now that we have a seat on the Security Council, I think it provides a perfect opportunity. We must ask ourselves those difficult questions and face the real issues with the effectiveness of current peacekeeping missions. TCCs with critical training gaps, inaction by peacekeepers, lack of analysis of the causes and drivers of conflict, fall back to traditional forms of peacekeeping, and an overemphasis on administration as opposed to operations. Can Ireland positively influence meaningful change? And are we currently capable of operating in these complex and dangerous conflict zones? I'll leave you with that.
Very good, Deirdre. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll be back to you later on to follow up on some of those points. I'd like to introduce now Mark Williams and Matt O'Neill. Mark and Matt are both postgraduate research students in the Leverhulme Interdisciplinary Network on Cybersecurity and Society, which is part of the Senator George Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security and Justice at Queen's University in Belfast. Mark's research explores the interface between social sciences and electronic engineering and computer science, focusing primarily on the criminal use of social media. In his project, he is looking at ways of detecting and preventing inappropriate and criminal behavior in social media, with particular emphasis on the mitigation, policing, and prosecution of offensive online expressions. Matt's research explores the European Union digital single market. His area of focus has been on artificial intelligence policy, examining the political, legal, and technical relationships surrounding intellectual property rights and relationships among member states. But together they've put their heads together and been doing a lot of work on this whole question of peacekeeping in cyber peacekeeping, I think is how Mark and Matt describe it. And for those of you who read Signal, there's an article in the next edition from Mark and Matt also on this topic, if I'm correct. So, Mark, over to you. I'm going to just put up the slide there, and can you see that? Okay, yeah.
Yes, thank you, Mauricio, and thank you for inviting us along tonight as well. So, the character of conflict is increasingly being challenged by the growing use of cyber and other capabilities by conflict parties. From the slide, you can see the recent Nagorno-Karabakh conflict offers us an insight into the transformative effects of digital technologies and how they're likely to contribute to the rapidly changing face of conflicts in the near future. Firstly, the conflict confirmed the importance of the information space to future conflict. Both sides expended significant resources attempting to control the narrative surrounding the fighting, to mobilize international public opinion, to attract foreign governments, and specifically social media platforms, particularly Twitter, were the central arena for information warfare efforts, with ordinary citizens and bots alike sparring in so-called hashtag narratives. Disputing the outcome of both fighting in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and alleging, and at times with justification, aggression and atrocities on both sides. Secondly, the integration of defensive and offensive cyber operations, including cyber espionage, while playing a limited role in this conflict, will undoubtedly be utilized in future conflicts to disable command and control systems and to attack national infrastructure. Sorry, Malaysia, can you move on to the next slide?
Sure.
However, the real lesson of this conflict is the effective Azerbaijani use of unmanned aerial vehicles, commonly known as drones, and the advantage this provided in terms of dispersed intelligence, surveillance, target acquisition, and reconnaissance, or in other words, ISTAR capabilities. Specifically, the use of relatively cheap, semi-autonomous, smaller drones known as loitering munitions systems, or kamikaze drones, which are capable of loitering over enemy positions for extended periods, meant military commanders could withstand war attrition, a technical advantage that provided pivotal in Azerbaijani assaults and deeply embedded Armenian defensive fortifications. As an aside, currently in Europe, only France and Germany have short-range anti-drone jammers and base protection assets capable of providing some protection against this type of drone. Most EU armies, especially those of small and medium nations like Ireland, would be as vulnerable as the Armenian military in any sort of modern kinetic warfare situation. Consequently, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict has shown ever increasing importance in modern conflict of effective, synchronized, combined operations at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels, and exponentially the more devastating consequences of failing to carry this out. As such, the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict underlines the need to integrate legacy systems with emerging technologies, and for additional investment in real-life military training that emphasizes multi-domain operations. The entire UN system will need to adapt to this trend, with major implications for how UN peace operations are designed and implemented. To be able to respond to these new and emerging dynamics, peace operations will need to understand not only how conflict actors use these technologies and how they're integrating them into their political and military strategies, but also how current emerging technologies can be leveraged to empower nations to better engage communities, to monitor conflict environments, protect civilians, and fulfill other mandated tasks. Alicia, could you move on to the next slide? Matt and I contend that Ireland needs to build on its proud heritage of working with the UN in the furtherance of peace by leading on the development and implementation of a cyber peacekeeping model that harnesses innovation to enhance mission effectiveness, to foster sustainable peace, and to advance the mandate of responsible behavior in cyberspace in the context of peace operations. However, underpinning all of this is the need for Ireland and the Defence Forces to foster a culture of cyber expertise and capacity, and to raise awareness of the possible tools and partnerships that need to be utilised and or developed for future peace operations. We also need to be more creative with how we attract and retain the expertise needed to facilitate such an endeavour, whether this is through the use and expansion of reservists, short-term service contracts, or strengthening of public-private sector ties. We believe that the advocacy of such a model would provide a lasting legacy for Ireland in terms of our membership of the Security Council and our commitment to the furtherance of international peace and security. And could you move on, Alicia? Thank you. To this end, in the following table, which Matt will talk you through later, we have mapped traditional peacekeeping activities to the cyber hybrid domain to demonstrate how mission mandates could be expanded to accommodate modern hybrid conflict. Many of these activities could be undertaken remotely, allowing for easier rotation of personnel, different lengths of tours, constant and uninterrupted operations, safer conditions for personnel who do not face risks on the ground, and most importantly, a repository of mission knowledge. So just taking one element from this table, observation, monitoring, and reporting. At a basic level, peace operations, as Deirdre said, often struggle with information sharing and analysis, and have staff to rotate frequently with little expertise in the area of cyber, digital technology, data handling, etc. Now, peace operations need for information and analysis is threefold. Firstly, it requires a coherent, real-time operational understanding of the mission area. In other words, a common operational picture at both the physical and now cyber level. Secondly, it needs early warning of imminent threats to life, to property, to infrastructure, etc. And thirdly, it needs sufficient information and analysis to identify risks and opportunities over the horizon. Situational awareness is essential for self-protection, but also for mandate implementation, especially when it comes to peace operations remits to protect civilian life. In a best case scenario, data can help to fill information gaps on a peace operations environment and identify patterns or trends related to the conflict dynamics. So to this end, for example, the Defence Forces could develop an information analysis platform, which would alleviate this information gap and facilitate the systematic capture and processing of large amounts of data on the basis of which well-founded conclusions might be drawn. In other areas as well, the use of digital technologies in peace operations has untapped potential. And the impact of existing uses is understudied, and empirical evidence is scarce. We contend that the Defence Forces could develop the multinational rotation contribution concept by providing a predictable supply of niche cyber hybrid capabilities to UN peace operation. This plug-and-play approach will provide conceptual continuity, enable greater flexibility in terms of the duration of deployment, and strengthen UN peace operations partnerships due to the limited number of niche capabilities amongst troop contributing countries. So I will now pass you over to Matt, who will outline some suggestions of how Ireland and the Defence Forces can develop this capability. Thank you.
Next slide, Alicia. So we're a double act people. So we're looking towards the sort of the future of this. The Secretary General at present has released his manifesto for his re-election for his second term. One of the challenges he's placed actually front and center in this is cybersecurity and national sovereignty. He addresses the state of national security will be more about data, critical infrastructure, and cyber than about tanks, guns, and soldiers, end quote. The idea of traditional security concepts need to be updated, requiring a tailored crisis management approach. There are huge challenges of digital technology developments in the 21st century, we all can agree, which need to be tackled head on. The Secretary General's key example is how disinformation and other harmful practices have been deployed to sever political and commercial agendas with a cohesive, decisive, and polarizing impact on societies and democracies. Interestingly now, there are plans being put in place to bring all stakeholders together to empower and strengthen Internet Governance Forum to ensure a robust implementation of the digital roadmap that the Secretary General has actually planned out, which the world has missed due to the 2020 pandemic, but will be coming into line now. The aim is to have a full respect of data protection, privacy, and other relevant human rights standards. The digital roadmap promotes such a vision of an inclusive, sustainable digital future by connecting the remaining 4 billion people to the internet by 2030. Within this roadmap, the role of women has been of high importance to the Secretary General, and he has repeated this in the document. He has stated that women need to have an equal role in designing digital technologies. As we have learned the hard way during the pandemic, the objective must be for everyone to be connected and have equity in that connection. One of Ireland's key strengths is the promotion of the women's security agenda at the UN and Security Council level, as well as having a distinguished and unbroken record in peacekeeping. But what is clear, and what Deirdre, I think, explained very well in the first segment of the talk, that there needs to be an expansion of this, and there needs to be an expansion into the digital to update and make Ireland's expertise current and relevant, because there's clear and present danger that already collective expertise could soon fall away and lose those skills that they've honed. So some of the key ideas we've put together is the current Security Council could be used as a vehicle to inspire and bring Ireland in line with the Secretary General's digital roadmap in raising the issues surrounding the technology and peacekeeping, as well as the digital divide and its impact upon women. Ireland can lead on these issues, now after its membership ends as well. It could be building its platform and positioning itself as a key stakeholder when it comes to the UN and working within a governance group. There is space here to include a private partnership because of Ireland being the Silicon Valley of Europe. There is room there, and they could bring these leaders to the table and help. Thirdly, transferring the UN training school to offer courses designed within these areas and building a reputation for Ireland as a neutral cyber actor, which I know Paul will be touching on later in his talk. Leaning into these strengths of women, peace and security agenda, as well as his years of experience in peacekeeping, is a strength. But we need to realize that strength can easily be lost if it is not kept up within the digital. Next slide, Malaysia. So we have designed a table, and there's 12 segments that we believe to map traditional peacekeeping into the idea of cyber peacekeeping. We have selected 5 core areas that Ireland on some level already does, and we believe they could be adopted and build around these areas going forward. Next slide, Malaysia. The first Mark has already touched on in terms of observation, monitoring, reporting. We believe the potential practical application would be that there could be adopt the UN cybersecurity certification scheme, similar to the one in the EU. They also could be understanding how they could observe threats universally recognized by human rights. And that's one thing I think is a big element under this. We have come at this with the human rights lens, following in of Irish foreign policy. And there is scope for this to be adopted and operated in that space. And I think that's often forgotten about when we're talking about digital policy, technical policy going forward. There's also a chance that Ireland could with other neutral nations work together in turning on understanding identifying potential flashpoints of cyber conflict online and how this can have real impact on the ground in real life, as well as online impacting others. Next slide, Malaysia, please. The next is ceasefire supervision and supporting verification mechanisms. Within this, we think Ireland could position itself to working with different areas. Going back to what Deirdre said at the start, talking about radicalization would fall under this point as a precursor to any of this happening in terms of a terrorist attack, understanding how there's a protection in terms of any form of elections, and understanding how you can bring 2 conflicting parties together to provide full assistance to UN cyber peacekeepers to dismantling botnets, malware, and denial of service attacks. Now, attribution is a different story, and that's much more complex and something that would need to be tackled down the road. But it would fall under this as well at different points. It is quite a fragmented process. Next slide, Malaysia. The third would be interposition as a buffer zone. Now, this would be talking about strengthened cyber security around critical and government infrastructure and systems in places that would not have the best cybersecurity from different foreign actors. I mean, I'm sure we're all very aware the UN Security Council is not fit for purpose as it stands because of different member states' priority, permanent member states' priority. But there is an issue in terms of protecting more vulnerable countries. There is a level of expert that can be exploited to help with protecting such infrastructure. Another element could be forming hosts, hardening, patching, and removing unnecessary service. Again, a lot of these approaches can be done remotely, and I think that is an attractive element into pursuing this as the next stage. Next slide, Malaysia. Security sector reform, which I think would be a big one. And this would be provision of training in terms of cyber defense, human rights, and privacy protection. Here we envision we would try and bring private and public partnerships together to expand this and understand what this means in terms of Ireland internally and how you can extend this form of soft power. It would require Ireland taking the lead and joining other nations in pulling together those perspectives and how they can reform cyber aspects of the security sector to try and integrate more of a human rights perspective as well as privacy protection. I know in terms of Europe, very advanced compared to America in terms of privacy protection for citizens, but how can this be exported in terms of third countries when going into conflict zones? And finally, Alicia, the final act, we believe the fifth provision is electoral assistance. Now, there's a really interesting case study in Colombia where the former President Santos actually established an election system to protect their networks because of disinformation against him. A story went around that he privately paid to the Swedish government to give him the Nobel Peace Prize, which was false. But there's real cases for this in how you can create stable elections. I know it's a big conscious point in times of interviews we've had and about how you can go and stabilize a country for a certain while, but without constant and persistent elections, there is room for destabilization. And again, we believe cyber peacekeeping is about identifying the precursor before any form of internal or online conflict happens. That is the main structure of this. Next slide, please, Malaysia. So for any mechanism, there needs to be a look at the internal terms of the political, defense policy and foreign policy. So one thing we've done is we've listed, I know maybe some of these talks, people aren't as direct in what we think could be done now, but we decided to make a list of recommendations based on a cross-sectoral study of the US, UK, Austria, New Zealand, and how they have approached these challenges. In terms of the political and, oh, sorry, I can't hear you, Malaysia, sorry. Well, we're back up, that's okay, excellent. In terms of, yes, peacekeeping policy. So the aim of these recommendations is so that Ireland will be able to ensure better warning and foresight mechanisms, identify and debunk false narratives, develop and design industry standards to protect critical infrastructure, identify operations and capabilities to be deployed in case of an attack, and understanding the role that it has within the framework of the EU and as a NATO partner, and expanding arsenal of potential response for hybrid threats possible. Now, in terms of the political, we believe there needs to be a formation and creation of a permanent and select Senate committee on cybersecurity in Dáil Éireann. We believe there needs to be a term of reference that must be established for the Irish government to engage with the meaning of cybersecurity and cybersecurity breach and cyberspace, as the question of neutrality must be addressed in establishing any form of cybersecurity policy to fall in line with Ireland's approach. We believe the Taoiseach, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Leader of the Opposition, and Chief of Staff, along with other ranking members of the Defence Forces, Department of Defence, and Department of Foreign Affairs, should serve as ex officio and with non-voting members on both committees when hearing about such attacks. And we also believe the Taoiseach's office should establish a special advisor on the role specifically for cybersecurity and a working group on the issue relating to cybersecurity as well. We also believe, like in establishing the select committee, they will need to have a form of jurisdiction on domestic and foreign cybersecurity risks. So acknowledging the state-sponsored threats to the Republic of Ireland internally. And this will include how does Ireland respond to a computer system of the Republic of Ireland being attacked? How does Ireland understand the infrastructure of the Republic of Ireland being attacked? If a citizen's computers are being attacked by within the Republic of Ireland, corporations and other businesses within the Republic of Ireland, and the commerce of the Republic of Ireland, there will need to be an understanding of how all these can be protected in terms of internal structure. Finally, there needs to be a review of law, policies, and authorities relating to the necessary of the Republic of Ireland to maintain a safe, reliable, and credible cyber posture for defending against and responding attacks in the terms in UN cyberspace. We have seen this recently with the HSC attacks and how there was not a full coordinated response at times. So the next slide, please, Matt. Another recommendation we have is the establishment of a Defence Force Military Cyber Reserve. The Defence Forces need to be able to mobilise in times of crisis or conflict. There should be an assessment on which reserve models would be operate best for the Defence Forces. Such models should be considered such as traditional uniformed reserve models, as well as non-traditional civilian and uniform reserve models, we believe. Ireland is fortunate to have a wide array of cyber talent within the country, and this should be looked upon with favourability. Such a reserve should not require the same drilling, grooming, or physical expertise requirements as traditional uniform reserves force. This intent is the same for the assessment of civilian reserve forces. The Defence Forces, along with the Department of Defence and Department of the Environment, Climate and Communication, should form an evaluation of the different mechanisms which are at hand for recruiting talented people from the private sector during times of crisis, as well as recruiting and retaining civilian talent with no prior military expertise that are interested in serving. We also believe the Chief of Staff's office should be assigned a budget with the focus on exploring and researching new cybersecurity issues, which could affect current serving personnel within the field. The Chief of Staff's office should be assigned a special advisor on the issue of cybersecurity as well directly. Finally, the Department of Defence and Defence Forces we believe should conduct a full review of internal cybersecurity assessment and formulate and define the different authorities of cyber operations and crime. The need for such an aggressive approach is because of the nature of rapidly changing strategic environments and to enable a clear, streamlined decision-making process during cyber attacks. And next slide, please. I'm wrapping up soon, so I apologize. Maybe lists of recommendations aren't the most exciting times in the talk, but I think it's very important to bring them up for discussion later on. In terms of foreign policy, the Department of Foreign Affairs should be afforded the ability to establish unit into on cybersecurity emerging technologies. There should also be an assistant should be established to advise the foreign minister exclusively. The assistant should serve as a principal cybersecurity policy official within the Department of Foreign Affairs and as advisor to the Minister of Foreign Affairs on cyber issues. This is needed to be able to lead the Department of Foreign Affairs in terms of diplomatic cyberspace efforts, which may include the promotion of human rights, democracy and rule of law, to include the freedom of expression, innovation, communication, and economic prosperity. Also, we also believe this is a very big point as well. Ireland is in a very unique position to take that leverage of its experience as well through human rights lens to advocate for norms of responsible behaviour in cyberspace and trust-building practices, the deterrence and international response to cyber threats, internet freedom, digital economy and cybercrime, as well as capacity building, which is often ignored. To address the issues and approaches around the question of neutrality within cyberspace and to lead other neutral nations within the European Union, develop an approach and best practice for neutral nations within PESCO and other security departments. So finally, next, yes, it is clear, back on Malaysia, sorry. It is clear within the UN Digital Agenda named Mapping the Momentum for the UN Digital Technology and Peacekeeping, show that digital technologies is a major policy objective for the UN in the coming years. We are seeing clear partnerships forming within the EU surrounding the effective use of digital policy, such as the UN International Telecommunications Union, launched at ITU's Partnership on Measuring IT for Development, Information and Communication Technology Statics. The United Nations Development Programme, a closer partner of peacekeeping, also developed its own digital strategy, Future Forward. We are seeing single resolutions emphasize data and ICTs are there to develop broader strategic foresight on how to profit from digital technologies, especially data without ignoring the drawbacks. How these developments within the wider UN system will be applied for peacekeeping remains to be seen. What is essential for both the UN in general and peacekeeping is not to let other strategies fade out and become well-intended but unimplemented programs. Within this space, there is room to set a level of precedent and ensure a partnership can be established. And this is, I think, a key area where we think right now it could be Ireland's legacy on the UN Security Council in holding this to account and drawing this tension out. According to Build Peace database, since 2013, there has been 168 projects to promote peace with technological components. Working with agencies outside the UN's domain is in line with UN goals to foster digital cooperation amongst digital stakeholders. It also provides a pool of knowledge and examples of how one could transition from strategies to definable actions that can serve peacekeeping well. So in sum, the stars are aligned. If Ireland would like to take the lead on this, they can. They have the ability, they have the expertise in their back door, they have the platform at the UN, and they're able to bring these together and lead on this if they want to bring in neutral EU partners, as well as working with smaller UN states. If the political will is there, if they're willing to do some small basic changes, some of the cost-effective changes we have made, they can. So I'll conclude and give over to Paul. In conclusion, the development of a cyber peacekeeping doctrine and the greater use of digital technologies in peace operations has untapped potential both for the furtherance of peace and security and for the defence forces in terms of innovation and a legacy. However, to meaningfully apply digital technologies in the field, the defence forces must foster a culture of cyber capacity and raise awareness of the possible tools and partnerships that need to be utilised and or developed for future peace operations. Similarly, Ireland as a Security Council member should seek to establish oversight and accountability frameworks from onset governing the mandating of US digital technologies in peace operations. There's so much work here to be done. Utilising the potential of digital technologies in peace operations can be a game changer for the defence forces and would position Ireland as the primary repository of expertise in cyber peacekeeping, and thus offer an authoritative claim to policy relevant knowledge and practices within this domain. The benefits of this are manifested and would only serve to strengthen the Defence Forces' proud peacekeeping legacy and act as an enduring testimony of Ireland's Security Council membership. I'll finish there and hand over to Paul. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matt. That was excellent. And our final speaker this evening is Paul Farrell, who is, well, Paul has had 3 careers to date. He first as an army officer, secondly as a consultant and partner at EY, and lastly as a partner and general manager Ireland in IBM. He has worked extensively overseas and specializes in business transformation and performance improvement. His core disciplines lie in digital transformation and large-scale program management, and as such, he has worked primarily in financial services, utilities, telcos, public sector, and health. Over much of his career, he has worked with many blue-chip clients both locally and abroad, reporting directly to the C-suite. He has led the transformation of a number of IBM divisions in Europe and concluded his career as general manager of IBM Ireland, leading a major restructuring of their global operations into Ireland. Paul has held a number of national board positions as well as internal board positions in IBM companies. He was awarded an honorary PhD from NUIG in 2019 in recognition of his services to the IT industry in Ireland. So, Paul, delighted to hand over to you.
Many thanks, Melissa. And I do apologize to anybody who was looking at that previous photograph, because if you served in chakra at any stage, you're probably having flashbacks at this stage. So apologies, but it was the best one I could find. If we could move on. So first off, the exposition that you've just heard from Matt and Mark is excellent in that it formalizes with academic rigor a number of the thoughts that have been floating around for a number of years, both internationally and locally. But let's step back for a moment and just ask ourselves, why should Ireland position itself for a cyber peacekeeping role? Well, first off, and since this event was scheduled, we've had the HSE attack, a demonstration that the threat is real, it's immediate, and unfortunately, it's unaddressed, particularly in this country. What we're currently seeing in cyberspace across the globe is the future of hybrid warfare. This is not something which is a temporary phenomenon. This is an emerging, growing, developing phenomenon, and it is now becoming embedded, as Deirdre pointed out, not just in the capabilities of major powers, but also in the capabilities of even the smallest of radical terrorist organizations. If it's not already here, it's coming to a conflict near you tomorrow. And we do have to prepare for it now. As we've seen with skills in the defense forces, these are perishable. They are mobile. If they are not being exercised, they will move. And if we look at the sort of skills that we need to prepare for, there's effectively 3 levels. The first one is the very simple one of cyber defense. And in a peacekeeping context, this really is an enhancement of force protection. When we put troops into Mali or Chad or indeed Lebanon or Syria, in the past, we put them into a hostile physical environment. We're now putting them into a hostile physical and cyber environment, and we have to protect our forces in cyberspace as well. For example, at a very simple level, most of you will have heard of the Strava breach, where highly experienced US special forces gave away their base location because they were going running and posting their run times on Strava. A very simple cyber breach, one that didn't require any technical sophistication, but demonstrated a lack of awareness of cyber defense among the troops involved. At the next level, in Ukraine, and particularly in the Donbass region, we've seen the use of cyberspace, not just for psychological operations against Ukrainian troops, but for physical targeting of MRLS and artillery strikes on positions where the strength of the position had been given away on social media. And then as Deirdre pointed, or sorry, as Mark pointed out earlier, in relation to the Azerbaijani-Armenian conflict, the level of sophistication of AI-equipped devices to be able to conduct targeting in real time of both physical and cyber signals derived from social media or straightforward RF transmissions is now at a level of sophistication where, as we saw in Libya, drones are now in a position to target and destroy positions without any human intervention whatsoever. So from a purely force protection, cyber defense perspective, these are capabilities we have to equip not just our defense forces, but every single member of the defense forces. If we move beyond that to what we might term cyber psyops, cyber peacekeeping now has the capability to identify and preempt the development of conflict situations. 25 years ago in Rwanda, a genocide was inflamed in large part by radio transmissions, by radio broadcasts over state radio. 5 years ago, we had moved from radio broadcasts to Facebook in the case of the Rohingya. I'll use the term genocide. I know it's a disputed term in reflection of this, but certainly the hostilities and the ethnic cleansing that was visited upon the Rohingya Muslims by the Myanmar government was enabled in large part by cyber psyops. And again, we've seen the same thing in Kashmir, we've seen the same thing against the Uyghurs, and so on. The development of a cyber peacekeeping and monitoring capability to be able to at least warn the UN, and particularly the Security Council, of emerging threats is absolutely critical. And the third level is cyber offense. Because having identified the cyber capabilities and the cyber resources of hostile actors, we should be in a position to counter these, to attack and destroy without cost to human life the capabilities that are being used either against our troops in theatre or indeed against innocent civilians in a conflict zone. This then extends to what Deirdre had mentioned earlier about this building of resilience within states, because as we know, most areas of conflict suffer from very low levels of societal resilience. By providing cyber peacekeeping capabilities to support the legitimate governments in these conflict zones, we can add greatly to the speed with which these countries can recover from hostile events or periods of conflict. I would say that Ireland's defence forces, and we've talked about it many times in IDFOC sessions, we're at an inflection point similar to the early 60s. And in the same way that overseas service gave the defence forces a new raison d'etre, a new mission, a new esprit de corps, and developed an enviable reputation among the countries of the world for peacekeeping. I think the inflection point that we are at now can similarly be affected by developing a whole new area of cyber peacekeeping, giving the defense forces a new raison d'etre and a new and readily understandable capability that our nation can rally around. The key point here is that the cost of entry is low. Delivering the capability is more flexible and location neutral than conventional peacekeeping. So to Mark and Matt's point there about the fact that a cyber reserve doesn't necessarily have to have the same levels of fitness or the same weapons, skills, and so on. They don't physically have to be in theatre. They can be here in Ireland without the physical costs associated with travel. And finally, our intelligence non-alignment reinforces our position as an honest broker. We don't have an NSA, we don't have a GCHQ. There is no benefit to us to hoover up data in conflict zones. Our only reason for doing this is, as I say, force protection of our own troops or support of the legitimate government or the innocent civilians in these conflict zones. So if that's why we should do it, how do we do it? Now, the first point I would make is that this is not something that could or indeed should be done by the defense forces on their own. This is a whole of society commitment, and it requires an approach to cyber peacekeeping similar to the approach to conventional defense taken by countries like Finland and Switzerland. To do it, we need to reorganize to incorporate the defense forces as they currently stand, the defense forces reserve, especially what used to be termed the first line reserve. The capabilities that are there in this space among defense forces personnel who are now in the private sector is absolutely enormous. It requires targeted reserves, targeted in the way the UK has targeted specific individuals with specific cyber skills and actively recruited them as opposed to passive recruiting, and taken in very specific skills to build up their cyber warfare capabilities. It also requires us to train veterans. When I worked in the UK with IBM, we supported a program for, which was set up as a charitable foundation to offer veterans prior to being demobbed the ability to train as cybersecurity professionals. Now, one of the things I would point out is that not every cybersecurity professional has to have a third level degree or to have a deep understanding of mathematics or computer science. Quite a lot of it in cybersecurity terms depends on organization, running a CompSen style skills, running an UpCenter style skills, organization, and particularly risk management. So to be able to offer veterans the choice of training in cybersecurity to equip them for a career when they leave the defense forces, but with an associated reserve commitment, I think is a win-win situation for both. It would, as Matt and Mark have pointed out, require the integration of third-party agencies. And in the case of cyber peacekeeping, we're already used to working with the Gardaí and indeed the Department of Foreign Affairs overseas as part of integrated UN missions. And finally, it requires the integration of wider society. The defense forces, with the best will in the world, cannot retain and build the totality of cybersecurity skills, particularly at the more technical levels that they need or that would be required for cyber peacekeeping. Even the UK and the US can't do that. But what we can do is we can leverage the technology companies of which we have so many here in Ireland. And in this regard, I would suggest that anybody who's cynical about why would tech companies get involved in a cyber reserve structure, have a look at IBEC's submission to the Commission on Defense, or indeed the American Chamber's report on digitalization that was published back in Q1, or indeed their cybersecurity paper from 2019. All of them point to the need for a very strong defense forces cybersecurity capability and single out the defense forces as the agency which should be given the task to build this sort of capability. And finally we do it by taking the lead. The UN wants us to get involved in this. The UN needs this mission. We are ideally placed at the moment with our place on the UN Security Council to call for and commission a study by the UN on the creation of cyber peacekeeping capabilities and to take the lead in developing it. And that is a position that will not come around for another 10 to 15 years. Next slide, please. So why center this on the defense forces? Well, first off, as I've pointed out, it's something that we have to do now. We should not be putting troops into conflict zones without the cybersecurity capabilities to at least offer force protection. It's complementary to the ISTAR capability that we are already developing a core competence in, as we've seen with the Nordic battle group and the German battle group. It builds on our national technology dominance. We have these skills in the wider commercial arena coming out of our ears. And finally, it offers a feedback loop into national defense capability in the same way that our overseas service, and particularly our membership of Partnership for Peace and working with regional military blocs as part of UN mandated missions, in the same way that that has developed our overall defense forces capability, by engaging in cyber peacekeeping, we enter into this virtuous loop whereby we can develop skills locally, we can provide doctrine, we can develop SOPs, we then deploy them into a cyber peacekeeping environment to exercise those skills, to evolve the doctrine, and then to also, as I say, augment our physical presence on the ground. And to take Dag Hammarskjöld's hackneyed quote, peacekeeping is not a job for soldiers, but only soldiers can do it. I would contend that cyber peacekeeping is not a job for soldiers, but only soldiers can do it. Thank you very much, Melissa, and back to you.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to stop sharing the screen now, so hopefully, so we're a bit shy here on questions. Let me see, we have one here from P.O. Smith. So P.O. is a regular supporter and attendee for the IDFOC. He says, will cyber ops become a stable of peacekeeping missions going forward? And will a new legal framework be required in order to facilitate cyber operations on future missions? Deirdre, maybe being the person with the most recent experience, would you like to take that one?
It is obviously a great question, and it should be the way forward, and you'd like to think that that's the direction it will go in, but I feel that the current capabilities just aren't there. I mean, I saw InfoOps and PsyOps was a completely new concept. CIMIC even hasn't been embraced in its military form. I do think we're a long way off. I was waiting on an EW capability from Tanzania to deploy for the entire mission, and I don't think it's still deployed out there, as I said, which would have been a game changer. So I don't think the main TCCs, when we see the countries that are committing the highest numbers of troops, the greatest numbers of troops, that they are well placed to actually do this. But again, there's an entry point for Ireland, as I said, to shape and influence this and to lead. But and I do think, well, there might be a league ad on the call, but certainly depending on jurisdictions, there would be some obviously legal implications as well that we would have to adhere to, and have certain I think agreements in place as well with the host governments as well if we're going to access particular information. The only capability I had really was to send out bulk kind of text messages, but we had no capability to intercept any kinds of communications. But if we could, and if we can going forward, I think it would be a massive plus for any UN peacekeeping force.
Can I just
You're on
add
mute,
to
Melissa.
what
Go mute.
Melissa-
I was just
Yeah,
going
just to
to,
add to
I was actually
what
just going to
Deirdre-
ask Mark and Matt if in your studies, if you've come across other defense forces or other military who have developed these capabilities that to date, and what I know in the UK, for example, there's the whole move to set up cyber operations, but in terms of actually deploying them into peacekeeping, have you seen anything in action yet?
In terms of action, no, but like you said, there's certain forces out there kind of developing this capability, especially sort of integrated multi-domain capability. You see it in the US, you see it in the UK, you see it sort of in the Baltic states like Estonia, and some of the Scandinavian nations as well, especially Finland. But they haven't been specifically deployed in peacekeeping missions yet.
Okay, so it's still relatively very, very early.
Can I just touch on what Deirdre was talking about as well in terms of legislative frameworks? I think she was right. I think sort of legislation will need to be worked out. But I also kind of think that UN definitions of peacekeeping are robust enough to kind of include cyber elements as well. I think there's other kind of elements of cyber legislation out there, like the Hague Convention, the Talon Manual, the effective control doctrine and overall control doctrine as well, that would kind of encompass this area, especially sort of around the area of attribution.
Okay, very good. Paul, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think the key one here is what the mandate is for any particular mission. So if the mandate agreed by the Security Council allows for it, then absolutely. And what I might do is I might just stray into the question there from Pio about whether the defense forces have the capability to block internet traffic and so on. My fear about that capability is, I think the law of unintended consequences will apply, because if you do that, you are immediately into the position of being seen as the aggressor rather than the peacekeeper in a particular area. If a peacekeeping mandate goes so far as to allow for example, shutting down the internet in a particular region, then I think that should be done by the Security Council itself, acting through one of the larger powers. So, for example, the NSA or the GCHQ, rather than by Ireland, because once you do that, you are inviting in retaliation into onto our home soil. And until we have a fully resilient cyber society, I don't think we're in a position to take on that risk. So, long answer to a short question. It all depends on the mandate of the particular mission.
Okay, very good. Matt and Marcus, is there anything you want to add to that?
No.
No. Okay. So a number of questions here from Rob Gilby. So there's been discussion about a cyber reserve. What should defense do to attract would-be cyber reservists, considering the lucrative remuneration packages that this talent already enjoys? And secondly, should the cyber reserve and the wider defense forces be capable of delivering offensive cyber operations? So maybe that's something we come back to. I mean, I suppose we've already kind of talked about offensive capability. Should the defense forces become more involved in conducting information operations as part of its peacekeeping endeavors, would this not bring its policy of neutrality further into question? Does the panel have any comments to make on the protection of physical cyber infrastructure, e.g. data centers, internet exchanges, and subsea and underground optical networks? So if we just take those maybe separately, the first one is around the challenge of attracting cyber reservists, considering that they're generally well paid already in their current roles. I mean, Paul, you might have some thoughts on that, given you're up until recently employed a lot of these kind of people.
Yeah, so I think there's three categories of people that would be interested in this, and I go back to my point that this has to be a whole of society approach. As I say, we have an immediate mechanism in terms of what used to be termed the first line reserve. And I had a discussion with Deirdre about this the other day. Most personnel leaving, and I include myself, and I know Deirdre had stuck her hand up for this as well, on leaving the Defence Forces generally have a huge well of goodwill towards the Defence Forces and are prepared to give of our expertise and our time. The point about remuneration in this plays to a much larger question about the reserves generally. I mean, we know legislation is required to provide a framework for both employers to release staff for reserve service and reserve training, but also to give reserve staff employment protections while they are serving as reservists. Nobody is going to sign up to join the reserves for money. They'll get it for, they'll get far more money working for Smart Tech or Ward or indeed IBM, right? They will do it because there are other aspects to this. There is the service aspect, doing something to serve the state, and particularly if it involves cyber peacekeeping. They will do it out of a sense of national pride. And from a very small sampling exercise I conducted among my own workforce last year when we were preparing the submission to American Chamber, there's a lot of people for whom, if you gave them the chance to go out on the ranges twice a year, and as a reward, for want of a better term, for putting in a number of days of cyber reserve service, it sure beats the hell out of playing World of Warcraft in your mummy's basement, right? And I say that as a joke, but actually it is something that motivates people at a certain age with a certain worldview and a certain personal view. So I think cyber reserve is something that we should not expect people to do for money, but at a minimum, we have got to improve the legislative framework for serving on the reserve. And that goes beyond cyber. That's in all forms of the reserve.
Yeah. Deirdre, I'm going to ask you question 3 there. Should the Defence Forces become more involved in conducting information operations as part of its peacekeeping? Would this not bring its policy neutrality into question?
I think on the question of neutrality, when we're deployed on peace operations, peacekeeping, peace enforcement, we're not there as a neutral party. We're there in defense of the mandate. We're there implementing the mandate. So I do think maybe there has to be kind of a distinction there when we're deployed overseas. And that's my understanding. But should we become more involved in conducting information operations? I definitely think so. It's part of under the umbrella of influence activities. So we have information operations, psychological operations, and CIMIC, when properly understood, utilized, and employed, really can again really increase when we talk about again this operational effectivity of our peacekeeping forces. So I would like to see the defences much more involved in this, in addition to PSYOPs, in addition to having a proper CIMIC capability. I think we are as a country, just in terms of how we're perceived when we're deployed overseas, without the colonial baggage. I think we engage very well with the population. I think we do human intelligence very well, engagement very well, information gathering quite well as well, and to feed that into this wider influence activities with info ops to the fore, I think would also enhance just the overall mission as well, and we can kind of shape and influence those that we're serving alongside. And I think there was a question as well related to that from Greg, in terms of what does the panel think of the employment of offensive info ops to protect our troop overseas? Yes, yeah, I mean, that's the reality of what we're facing. Our adversaries, the illegal armed groups, the extremist armed elements, they're using info ops and PSYOPs just incredibly well. And sometimes by kind of rudimentary methods over WhatsApp, using YouTube, propaganda videos. I know in the DRC, the SRS, the special representative of the SRSG, has just recently come out and highlighted just how this has impacted the UN and the troops over there, because of how effective the messaging is of those that want to spread misinformation, disinformation, and really undermine the role of the UN in the DRC. So I think when we can go and take an offensive posture when it comes to information operations and psychological operations, that's where we'll get the competitive advantage as well, in terms of implementing a mandate. And I do think as well, our mandates have to be responsive to this new reality. Our mandates have to be robust, and we as a country and TCCs have to be willing to actually implement those mandates robustly. There was a great quote by a former force commander that said we should be interpreting the mandates in terms of them being the floor and not the ceiling. We shouldn't use them as a blanket to wrap ourselves up in and protect ourselves and use them as an excuse for inaction. We actually should be trying to build upon them and figure out ways as a peacekeeping force to proactively take action to protect civilians. And I think, one of the reasons the DRC is such an interesting mission is because we have the Force Intervention Brigade. We have blue helmets deployed in a warfighting capacity in the name of protecting civilians. We can proactively use force. And I can see that maybe being a feature of a lot more mandates. I think we should, as a force, be proactively using force to prevent and preempt violence against civilians. And information operations and offensive info ops is an element of that overall process.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Deirdre. So Matt and Mark, you and I, we've talked in the past about the ability to protect the physical cyber infrastructure, and particularly in rebuilding states post-conflict, etc. Do you want to take this question here about comments on protection of physical cyber infrastructure, data centers, internet exchanges, subsea and underground optical networks, etc.? Yep.
Hi, Roger. Yes, so just to kind of go back to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, one of the major things we saw at the onset of that conflict was the Azerbaijani forces took out Armenia's EW assets, or electronic warfare assets, and also the use of kind of redundant Russian systems to kind of deter and to defend against drones. So yes, I think kind of any conflict needs to kind of be cognizant of this and needs to be cognizant of the fact we do need to defend against these. We need to sort of defend against this kind of infrastructure. And as Deirdre said, and Sir Paul mentioned as well, to possibly then launch sort of offensive cyber attacks that kind of counter these threats as well.
And the only thing I would say add to that is you have to be able to have that capability, because we need to get out of the idea of just states alone. There are rogue actors or ransomware people for hire by other states and proxy states being used in this. And there is a need to protect that infrastructure. And I could see that actually becoming part of the mandate in the future. Again, if you go back to the documents I referred to for the Secretary's re-election, there is an element about how we build that level of digital policy into peacekeeping, and talking about how there needs to be protection of sovereignty, but also about how there needs to be protection of UN systems. And I could see over the next 10 years an expansion out from that idea coming to the fold. Really all that's needed from our discussions about the UN is for one member state to actually raise this as a question, and they have a set of policies they're willing to interact right away, but each member state aren't willing to take the first step to stay at the Security Council level. So there is operational frameworks sort of being put in the background, but again, without any form of member state support, they can't come in the pool.
Okay. I don't know, Paul, is there anything you want to add to that?
I think, again, I make reference to some of the industry submissions on this. I wouldn't necessarily regard this as something that's in the cyber peacekeeping domain. This is a fundamental aspect of national defense, which, irrespective of a cyber peacekeeping discussion, we should be capable of defending anyway. And it is on this, I mean, I can point out, this is on the risk register of most of the large tech companies, that we are currently unable to defend the vast investment of IP that multinational companies have made in Ireland, or the physical infrastructure associated with it, because we have no air defense to stop somebody flying a plane into one of the AWS data centers. We have no ASW capability to prevent undersea interference with our internet cables. But we just have no capability currently. And our ability to attract further inward investment, and I have said this at government level, our ability to attract further investment is being hampered by, people like myself. Can we put our hand on our hearts and say, right, if you put a new data center into Ireland, can it be defended? And the answer at the moment is no. Now, I would say this is not necessarily going to be a problem for a commercial company making a decision to invest in Ireland. But where it will be a problem is at a government level. It's only a matter of time before, for example, the US government says, oh, hang on a second, guys. We've now got 3/4 of the email capacity of a particular email server sitting in Ireland. Is that defended? Is Ireland in a position to secure that? What is Ireland now the weak link in securing America's data, America's emails, all of that against hostile actors? So this is absolutely fundamental to the job that the Defence Forces should be doing now, is defending the national economic infrastructure. And I think that is absolutely a priority. And you will see, as I say, in the IBEC submission to the Commission on Defence and the various AmCham reports over the last 3 or 4 years on cyber, that this is being taken very, very seriously by the industry associations.
Yeah. Good. Okay, Deirdre, I'm going to swing back to you there. Do you think that domestic threat from extremism and radicalization will begin to outweigh the international problem anytime soon? If so, what role for the Defence Forces? And that's from Darren Doherty.
Simply, do I think? No, I don't think it'll outweigh the international problem anytime soon. But I do think all we have to do is look to the States and see the rise of both the far right and the far left. We look to the UK. Interestingly, I think Germany is providing quite an interesting case study at the moment in the run up to the elections, the rise of conspiracy theorists, the rise of again both right and left-wing extremism. So I think we do again have to face the reality and say that Ireland isn't going to be immune from this, and we do need to not just kind of monitor it in kind of a wait and see approach, but proactively, again, which this is about, is building out our capabilities in anticipation of a rise. I do think when it comes to the Defence Forces, and Paul has mentioned this extensively, this whole of society approach. I mean, we just have to walk around Dublin and we see the European headquarters of Facebook, of Twitter. We have LinkedIn, we have Google, and there's huge expertise there, and there's maybe a willingness there to form some strategic level partnerships, figure out ways of sharing insights. rather than kind of data, and looking at leveraging their expertise as well to build out these capabilities. So I think, you know, the Irish Defence Forces, something that all militaries do very well is plan, is analyze, is conduct that full, you know, operational planning process, and look at current and future threats. So maybe, you know, there's a role for us in bringing together all the different entities, all the different government departments with a stake in this, civil society, tech, the academics, and being the kind of focal point with consolidating those efforts. And I do think with our eye on, you know, national security and looking at our own vulnerabilities, we should certainly be playing a central role in that.
Okay, I'm very conscious that we're gone over an hour and a half here, so I think we'll soon bring this to we'll bring an end to the evening, because I appreciate all the time you put into this. There have been a number of questions, I suppose, that have touched on the offensive capability and even hybrid peacekeeping. We've heard about hybrid warfare. I haven't heard of hybrid peacekeeping before. But Paul, maybe I see your name mentioned there. Is that something you want to take? We'll discuss.
Yeah, as I think I touched on it earlier, we absolutely do need to develop offensive capabilities, cyber offensive capabilities. However, we should not publicize and certainly not deploy these unless we have a sufficiently robust defensive capability first. Because once you go on the offensive, you will be targeted in response. So the way I would suggest we need to do it is to build up the defensive capability, to build those SOPs, develop those skills that unfortunately have perished over the years, to develop the legal and organizational framework for this. And once we have that in place and exercised it in cyber peacekeeping, then and only then should we engage in cyber offensive operations. And a very simple example of this would be, we saw the Americans responding as a result of the Colonial Pipeline ransomware attack. And they did it absolutely right. They went after the proceeds of the attack, and they got most, though not all, of the Bitcoin back. That ability to deter hostile cyber actions by the threat of immediate response is a capability that is absolutely needed. But as I say, walk before we run, develop the defensive capabilities first, then the offensive, and only deploy the offensive if we are absolutely certain we have a robust defense posture.
Very good. Mark and Matt, I know, is there something that you've built into your framework?
I'd just like to refer, I know maybe it wasn't the most exciting highlight of the talk, but just the actual points I made with Paul's taking back. I think, sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts. I think the points I was trying to get across is, I totally agree with Paul, but taking a step back in terms of leadership, in terms of political leadership, I don't think the full understanding of how things operate, and that's not any shine our leaders. They have like 10 things to think about once when moving forward. And that's why I think it's very important, why I give sort of the cost-effective recommendations of having special key advisors that are non-political aligned, that stay in post continuously for the different levels to act and give guidance to leaders to make those decisions. So they're fully informed of what decisions they're making if there has to be an offset capability. I know for a fact, in terms of Paul's example, you know, when it comes in, there is a specialist in cybersecurity advice to the president. And then when it comes to Congress, that joint committee will receive a joint report, and they will have their interpret special advisors speak in that. And those special advisors will meet together and communicate all that information together, so so that all key parties in the political system are very aware of what decisions we make and how there will be key effects and possible consequences later down the road as this offensive attack happens, and what are the key gains now. I don't think that capability is there in the political structure to understand, to make those decisions. So you don't follow anybody's own. I just think it's a simple process to go forward, to get the right people in the room to make that right decision so that everybody is understanding of what happens. And I know that's why I think I was very keen to make those internal arguments that needs to happen.
Okay, very good. So I do think it's probably time to wrap it up, and remains for me to thank all our panelists again for their great contribution. And as I said, hopefully this has been recorded and will be available in due course on our YouTube channel. So to Deirdre, Paul, Matt and Mark, a very big thank you, and a good evening to all our attendees. And we look forward to having you with us again in the not too distant future. Thank you all, and have a good evening.